right, well, welcome to the second session in our JS Bootcamp for 2012. My name is Pete Frueh. I'm on the profile team, web development, and profile team, go. So what we're going to be talking today is about DOM events. If you guys were here, how many people were here yesterday? Yes, quite a few. You saw Seth and Raul talk about JavaScript as a language bit, and I think today we're going to be doing a little bit more hands-on stuff with how do you actually do things in JavaScript with the DOM. I tend to think of web development as both, a little bit of science, a little bit of art, and definitely we'll be getting into the art of things. But in order to do that, you kind of have to know basically what's happening under the hood in the browser. So with document object model events, events is kind of an overloaded term depending on your context. This is specifically for the DOM, how it works in a web page and when people are clicking on things. So the outcome of this hopefully is that you all understand what happens when someone clicks on something, how you can get information about that event, how you can do things with it. So since it's document object model, the first thing to discuss is what is a document. So here's one I'm sure you all know and love. This is the 1040. On the left is the instructions, the first page of the instructions. It's a document. It has an image in it. It has some large text, some small text. On the right is the actual document as a form. So we have a document with a form in it on the right. This is exactly what Google is. As you can see, it says doc type, document type, HTML. It's a document with a form in it. Yahoo is a document. Facebook.com is a document. Facebook is also a very bad investment. I didn't say it. LinkedIn.com is a document, and all the pages on LinkedIn is a document. So this is kind of my prerequisite brainwashing for this, is that I know a lot of you are engineers and you're used to thinking about server-side code. Since this is the document object model, we're going to be talking about it in the browser. So hopefully I can get you to start to think of things as a document in the browser. And if you think back in the web, we had static, it started out as static documents, right? You went and fetched stuff, came back. We weren't doing a whole lot of server-side dynamic rendering, right? Now that's pretty much all the web is. They contain images, forms, links, everything else, and no matter how dynamic it seems, it's still a document. The 1040, for example, is a document, and in fact, it changes year by year, right? So you get, there might be a new law that goes through, and there's a new section of that form that they add. So the web pages, web pages are the exact same thing, but they may be changing second by second, like in your stream on LinkedIn. But ultimately, it's a document. So what we're going to talk about, basically, is the browser object model, a subset of that, which is the document object model. And I want to say we actually switched around these sessions. DOM scripting was supposed to be this week, but the presenter is gone. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the DOM, because you actually have to know the DOM in order to work with events. We're going to talk about how to attach them, detach them, the event flow, which is basically once you have this document, what happens when you click, what is that event, where is it going throughout the document. The event object, which enables you to access information about it at any given point. And then ultimately a pattern of event delegation, which is probably the most useful event-related pattern. And it's quite powerful. It saves memory. So first things first, the browser object model. So, we talked about JavaScript as a language yesterday. I think the interesting thing about JavaScript is that basically it's a great language for interfacing different environments. So in the case of like web development, basically you aren't necessarily doing a whole lot of heavy lifting and heavy programming with JavaScript, but you're always using it to interface the environment. And the first thing that you're going to always work with at the top level is the browser object model. So this is basically how it interfaces with the browser, how the browser lets you do things in JavaScript, and it all starts with the window object. What this entails, and this isn't even talking about documents yet, is it allows you to access the location. You can get the location. You can set the location, which causes the browser to request another page and redirect to it. You can get information about the frames, histories. It has properties, methods, events. You have methods like you can open a window, you can close a window. You can alert something. You can set a timeout, which accesses, which is a different thing. And you can listen for events. If a user clicks on the right bottom of the browser and slides it up, there's an event that fires. So you can tell that just happened. When they resize, scroll, all those things. So the first one, we're going to do a bunch of exercises in this one. And we're using JS Fiddle. If you want to type in this URL, basically jsfiddle.net, or you can just simply watch. I'll go through it. It might be a little bit hard to see since we're going to be working in code, but /pfrueh, P-F-R-U-E-H, /A, capital X, lowercase t, lowercase f, uppercase n. Hopefully this works here. OK. So JS Fiddle, just for a quick background, really cool tool. In the upper hand left, you have the HTML. Basically, web development is typically made of three different things, right? You have the HTML, the markup. You have the styling, which is CSS. You have the JavaScript, which is interaction. And ultimately, that's the output that you can manipulate. So we have the HTML up at the upper left. In this case, we just have JavaScript. We're not going to do a whole lot with CSS at any time during this talk. And then the lower right-hand side is basically what the user is going to see. And when you want to run code, you just click the run. So if you change the code, click run, it will re-render it. So in this case, this is just a quick example of, we're still talking about the BOM, right? So it's like, we'll hit run on comment, and I can get information about the browser from this, right? So we have a navigator object, we have a user agent property, which tells about what browser we're using. We have the location. We can get pieces of that location by drilling into the location object. And then ultimately, I set a timeout, and hopefully in 5 seconds, there it is. It opens a new window. So the browser object model basically allows you to modify the browser itself, navigation, things like that. So there's a special property on the window in the browser object model, which is the document object. So to describe the DOM first, it's a language and platform neutral interface that allows programs and scripts to dynamically access and update the content and structure of documents. It's a mouthful, but basically there's tons of language. Almost every language has a DOM implementation. It's an interface. And like Java, for example, you can read a file, turn it into a DOM object, and then you have the same methods and that you can act upon the document with. But what we're going to be talking about specifically is how this works with HTML pages today. So in a browser, it's created automatically. You have a couple of different objects. You have the window object. And these things are available before your script is ever executed. So whether you put your script in line or whether you're pulling in a file or whatever, the window object's there, location, all the BOM stuff is there. The document is there too, but the document isn't necessarily loaded. And you can think about the difference between the BOM and the DOM as, not only is it the browser stuff, but the browser object actually takes this document and loads it into itself. And at that point, you have the document object itself, and it's ready to roll. The other thing to think about before we go into there is that if you think about like an HTML file, right? I mean, what is it? It's just a string. It's just it has a number of different, it's actually just a string, but we need a way to represent that so that we can navigate it. Because how much would it suck to have to like parse a string every time you wanted to manipulate things, right? That's the point of the DOM, is it creates a model for what we consider an HTML string, right? I mean, it's just from the HTML open tag to the close tag, just takes all that stuff and converts it into something that we can manipulate. That's the idea behind it. So everything's a node in the DOM. So, and that's the base class. So essentially, like, we have the superclass of node, and then there's 12 subclasses. And the DOM has kind of an interesting way of looking at the world. As with a lot of specifications, it seems like they kind of tried to make everyone happy or compromise. And so the node interface in the DOM is basically kind of a flat. You can use it for a lot of things, and you could really just use the node interface for anything. It's basically a flattened view if you were to do that, versus the subclasses, which would be things like document, element, attribute. You can look at the DOM like that too. You have the document object, which is given to us. You have the element interface, which basically you can retrieve elements, attributes. What's interesting about attributes and some of the things with the DOM, because you can do it both ways, there's different ways to accomplish the same thing. So on the element interface, we have set attribute, which essentially creates an attribute node. And you can also, off of the document interface, create an attribute too and append it to an element. So there's kind of multiple ways you can look at things. Text nodes are simply just text, because everything has to be defined in order for the document for it to make sense.
Quick question, is the DOM different for different browsers? Do all the browsers have the same class?
So the question is the DOM different for different browsers? Yes, but not that much different anymore. We'll get into that actually, like a little bit of what happened and why we even have this standard. And I don't know if I know all the history, but I know enough to kind of fudge it through. So let's look at the DOM. So here we have an example of a container on the page. So why is there just a container, an empty div, and we have some output for LinkedIn, right? We have a link there. The reason is we just created it. So in this case, we have a container. We already have the container on the page, so all we need is to get a reference to it. So we use getElementById on the document object itself. We get a reference to it. Now what we're going to do is create an anchor. We're going to create an href, and we're going to create text, and then we're going to compose all those things together and append it into this. So the question is where does all this stuff exist in the interim between when you actually start working with the DOM and when it's actually showing up on the page? And it exists, in memory. Like, it doesn't really exist anything until you actually append it to the document. Another thing to note is that, so this looks like a lot of code, right? This would be a lot easier just to say, my container inner HTML equals a href, blah, 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 one string. And say it's 2 lines of code compared to this, right? And you'd be right. That is a better way to do it. It has better performance, but the reason why we're going to do it like this, and I want to show you this, is because events don't have an equivalent kind of easy way of doing things with inner HTML. You pretty much have to look at it from the DOM's point of view at that point. Another thing to note about inner HTML, just as a side note, is that when you assign inner HTML to something in the DOM, basically what happens is the browser actually does convert it into the model immediately. So if you do an inner HTML on a huge chunk of HTML, and then immediately after that in your code you say get elements by tag name for something that you just inserted, it will be there. So that's kind of cool. That's the beauty of inner HTML, is that you can actually work on the nodes immediately after. The browser kind of takes care of that for us. So one other thing to note about this, if you uncomment the bottom section too, and you hit run, we have node types. So this doesn't seem that interesting, right? You have a document has a type. So we have 12 subclasses, and you have a document's type 9, elements are type 1, attributes are type 2, text is type 3. Doesn't seem that interesting, right? But it's actually, there's newer ways of doing things, but the reason why this can be very useful to know which type you're working with is there's a bit of history with Netscape versus IE. A lot of this talk is I'm going to be explaining some of the differences between these. I'm not sure what the current state of is with this, but at one point when I used to do a lot of like tree traversal in the DOM, Netscape would say, well, first of all, think of HTML, right? If I have two words side by side, one space from a user point of view is the same as if I hit space 5 times or 10 times, right? There's always one space between those two words that I put on there. And that's kind of the nature of HTML, where white space is just kind of one thing, right? You have to explicitly say, use the HTML entity of non-breaking space if you want to force 5 spaces or force 10 spaces. So what's interesting is, what happens then between two elements? So say I have a div, and I put a space between that and the next div, because maybe I want my code to look clean. If everything's represented in the DOM as a node, what is that thing in between those two tags, right? It's presumably a text node, right? Well, that's what Netscape said. That's a text node. IE said, well, basically, we know what you're trying to do. If you have two elements side by side and nothing in between, then they're siblings, right? And or they're immediate siblings, right? Netscape says, no, there's actually text nodes. So you have the div, you have a text node, and another div, and all of them are siblings together. So as you're traversing through the tree and you're trying to find stuff, you end up having this problem of, you have to actually code for those things. And in that case, you would say, is this previous sibling node type 3? If not, go to the previous sibling until you get to it. So that's why it can be useful. OK, so we have the browser object model, which is manipulating the actual browser itself. We have the document, which gets read by the browser and converted into an object. Now, we can manipulate things in code and whatever, but the real key, and pretty much the only reason why you want to use JavaScript, is for interaction, right? The user clicked on something, and I want to know what happened, so I can load some more stuff, or I can show this, or do whatever. What used to be done, if any of you have been doing this for longer than probably, 5, 7 years or so, you'd see this, right? You'd just have inline HTML events on click. And these are kind of their own special thing in that there's two objects that are available. The event object, which is actually that, it's spelled out event, that would refer to the event object that we're going to talk about in a second. And this, which refers to the actual A tag, or whatever it's attached to, the node it's attached to. So what ended up happening as people did this, typically you'd have an on-click and then you run a function. This was a pattern that kind of started to emerge before we kind of moved into the next phase, which was, have something handle your some event, or a function handle some circumstance, and just pass in the event and the reference to the node so that you could do stuff with it without having to explicitly say, something specific to that. Pass something specific to the function. OK, so DOM0. It's kind of a dumb name, but it basically defines everything before things were defined, if that makes sense. DOM0, OK, so there's a lot of information, I know. So by the way, we have people somewhere in the background that, as you go through these exercises, or if you're doing anything, they can help you out. DOM0, how can I explain this? So talking back to the point of, do browsers have the same DOM? They have the same document, but they chose to do two different things back in the day. With Netscape, it's pretty much like Netscape 3.4 and IE4. It used to be a real pain to get references to nodes in the document. IE would have like a document.all, and you get them. Netscape Netscape had like layers. They defined this object very different, how to get references very differently. But I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, basically what ended up in DOM 0 is attributes on nodes. So you have an A tag, for example, and it has an href attribute. That would end up being, once you had a reference in JavaScript to that node, it would end up being a property of that reference. So you'd have the dot notation. So if you referenced an image, it would be image.src would be equivalent to the tag of having an src attribute. And that's the way scripting was kind of done. The click events are no different. We had non-click attribute. Now it's a non-click on there, and it's a event, right? So what's the problem with this? That seemed to work fine, other than getting different references for different browsers, which they finally standardized. The problem would be that, what if I want to attach multiple events, click events, to that div, right? What if I have a lot of code and I need to handle a lot of cases? I only have one function that I can use. What if I'm working with another developer and he wants to do something too? It's a problem. In any case, you'll see that now at this point, though, I can call that event whatever I want that's coming in there. And it refers to the same thing as it did before. DOM level 1, basically, which we didn't show in here, basically took the idea of the document and really specified for XML and HTML how those nodes are defined, which is what I talked about earlier. In DOM 2, they introduced events. And these were implemented pretty quickly in browsers. I think like maybe IE 5, 5.5, something in there, and Netscape 6, once they decided to go the pure standard route, they all started to do this. So the difference is, though, is that IE actually didn't implement the DOM's recommendation for the event model. So here we have a reference to an element. The W3C says, add event listener. You have an event type. You have a function that you're going to call. And then the false, what we'll talk about later. IE had this model of attach event. Both of these things, you could assign multiple listeners to the same element. But IE, we'll talk about what that third parameter is in an example. But there is a difference between these two. And for the most part, you don't have to, at this point, you don't have to necessarily worry about the IE model, because in 9 they started doing it differently. So how do you actually attach things? Well, the concept, you'll probably hear this a lot in JS Bootcamp, of feature or object detection. What used to be very common in JavaScript is that you would say, is this IE 6 or is this Netscape 4 or something like that, then do something. The best practice now is to look for objects, see if they exist, and then follow through. So at the top, you have basically attaching events. In the DOM model, it's add event listener. In IE, it's attach event. And then the opposite of that, removing them. And one thing to note, too, is IE always had this concept of on. They would put on. So if you've ever seen event code that people write, it's always like on plus whatever the event is when they're trying to do cross-browser stuff. OK, so here we have examples. This is, I don't know if you guys can see the URL there, but it's EVXMW with the E, X, and W all capitalized. We have the three different things. We have a reference to the node, which is myDiv. And all of these three will do the exact same thing in this case. So when I click on myDiv, I get an event object, which tells me what the event, what caused the event, the type, which tells me what type of event it is, and then a reference, in this case, to this, which is the element that was clicked. And these will all work the same way, whether it's DOM 0, DOM 2, and in the case here, we have jQuery loaded. jQuery offers more things you can do with events. You can pass in data and all this other stuff. The interesting thing about jQuery 2 is that it actually standardizes. There are some things that we'll get into with event bubbling and stuff. Certain events don't bubble. And so jQuery basically took that event object and standardized it and made it work everywhere. In this case, too, we have like another, you can tinker around with this with handle mouse over, mouse out, and you can hook it up to the DOMs. Okay, so here's kind of a side note about this too. So we said we had a browser that loads in a document. Some of the objects are available instantaneously. The document, when you want to manipulate it, is not necessarily. We don't know, right? So we need to actually hook up an event to listen for when the document is ready. And there's a difference between the document being ready and the page being loaded. The difference would be things like images, other resources that are pointing there. Here's a good example of that, where you have a document loaded versus, so the document's done on the left, and we're still waiting on the right for the actual page load, which is everything, including images and everything else. So the best practice is really to hook up events. You can start hooking up events immediately once the DOM's ready. Unless, of course, you need those images or something like that. And basically, because IE didn't support this before 9, use a library, right? There's a lot of hoops you have to jump through for Internet Explorer. There's various ways you can test to see if the document's ready, and they're all ugly. They're horribly ugly. So jQuery has a document ready, or you can just use the $ and you put your function in there. Instead of referencing a node in jQuery, you can put a function that says this is something that runs when the document's ready. All right, so event flow. This is probably the most important part of this talk. If you're going to remember anything, remember this. There's 3. All right, so how can I explain this? So there's basically 3 things that happen. A user clicks. So we're going to use clicks as our example here. A user clicks on a document. What's happening in the browser behind the scene is that an event starts at the document level, the HTML level, body, it goes down, until it gets to the thing that people click on. That's called the target. And then it goes back up and it bubbles back up through the document up to the HTML again. So here's a bit of history with the whole IE Netscape thing also, is that when Netscape came out, they said, when they were both kind of coming up with their own document object models and how they were going to do events and all this stuff, Netscape says, an event should be that when someone clicks on something, it should flow from the HTML tag down through the body and every node in between until it hits the target. And that's the way the model should work. And of course, complete opposite of what IE does, which is says, no, the event starts at the target, that's where the person clicked, and it bubbles up to the top. So in W3C's, make love, not war kind of mentality, he said, let's do both, right? Let's make this both. But they did say that what ended up happening is you actually have a bubble. The bubble is always there. The capture, you can toggle on and off. And that's what that last parameter in the false that we saw in the add event listener is. That's toggling the capture phase. So you have basically 2 choices. You can say, I just want my events to bubble, which is the default, or actually add the capture before that, too. And this is where it gets kind of interesting on events. So there's a capture phase, a target phase, and a bubble phase. So here's an example of how this works, right? We have a container with an unordered list in it and 1 item. What I have here is a reference to the container, a reference to the list, and a reference for the item. And I'm attaching a click event to each of them. And each of them should basically alert what it is, and we'll see what order these events fire in. So if I click here, the first thing that comes back out of all of these 3, and I could move these around, is the item, the list, and then the container. What we saw is that we turned off capturing. So in this tree, it starts the event starts at the container, it goes to the list, it goes to the item. And since I said, I don't want capturing, it's actually going to start at the target, and then it's going to climb back out. And that's the order that they fire in. Now, if I turn on capturing, right, and I run this, and I turned it on the unordered list, which is exactly between the two, I click, well, now the list goes first, the item goes after it, and then finally the container. So what happened was in that capture bubble phase, we said, at first we had everything just bubble. So start at the target, and we fired the events like this, right? So we went target to the next one, all the way to the top. Now I turned on the other one, and I said, don't capture it over here on the bubble side. Capture it or run it on the capture side. So as the event went from the document down, it saw that, it ran that function, went down to the target, fired that one, came back up. It's no longer on the bubbling side of things, and then so it didn't run, and then it went to the other one, to the container, ultimately. So if you get a chance, play with this. It's kind of interesting. If I were to turn on capturing for this one, now this function is going to run on the capturing side. So I have a container, list, and ultimately I've reversed the order of them. So I probably shouldn't say this, but no one uses capturing, right? No one uses it. This is completely worthless to you. But it's not really, because IE is supporting this model now, right? No one uses it because I don't think, this is my opinion, I don't think anyone's really figured out a good, an interesting way of using it yet, right? We're in a mobile world now, and we don't have to deal with things like IE pre-9. And so all of the things at this point that happen in JavaScript events is that we just use bubbling at this point. It's an important thing to note, but I'm guessing you'll probably see people use capturing once it's supported everywhere. I don't know how that's going to be used, but it inevitably will be. OK, so we know how the order of them fire, right? We have this capture bubble phase. What happens, when I passed in that E object to each of these, I can actually look at what happened in the event. So the type, I can say the event will tell me what type of event it is. Was it a click? Was it mouse over? Was it a submit on a form? You have a target. Now the difference between the target and the current target is the target is actually the one that's at the bottom. That's the one that the user actually clicked on. The current target can be any element that's an ancestor of that target. So it's what element was actually you applied the attach event to, or the add event listener to. We'll get into that, because that's where event delegation comes into, and it's a better pattern for using events. The other thing is that you have the option to prevent default, which basically tells the browser whatever your default action is, and this is typically used on anchor tags, don't do it, right? I want a user clicked on a link, like our like link or something like that. Don't go to a URL. I actually just want to handle this event myself. So you prevent the default action. That does not stop the flow, right? You've just told the browser, whatever happens, don't do what you typically do. Stop propagation stops the flow. So whether you're in the capturing phase, the target phase, or the bubbling phase, basically your handler can say, and this is pretty much bad practice, because you want different parts, because people program in a way that expect this process to happen. You generally do not want to stop the propagation, stop the event from going any further. So you can do this on the capturing side. If I were in that unordered list to say stop propagation, neither of those two other events would have fired. There's an interesting thing when we get into event delegation. Stop propagation is not recommended, because you can do useful things at a high up in the DOM tree that you may want to handle for an entire page, for example. So here's the next example with SAGRQ, and it's target, current target, prevent default, propagation, and we'll look at toggling of capture a little bit more. Okay. So we're talking about the event object itself. What information can you get off of it, right, as this thing's going through there? Here we have the container again, but we just are listening for events on the container and the link. When I click on this, and what's in the dialog isn't really important here. So we had this bubble thing again, where the link is nested inside the container. It bubbled up. First the link fired, then the container fired. The container, what's interesting here is that the event that the container receives has this target property which says that it was the link that fired the event. And then it has the current target, which is itself. So there's the difference. The first one only saw itself because it was deeper in the tree. And this one actually can look at either of those. And we'll see why this is interesting, because you now have all of the information that the other one does, but you have it at an ancestor level instead of at a descendant level. Here's what stop propagation does. If I at that lower one, I run this again, right? Now it never bubbled up. So I've stopped that from happening. Prevent default, which I'm using in this case, basically says don't go to where that link is, which is my public profile link. Just stay on the page. Okay, so a note about IE, right? They had the equivalent in their old event model, which is, one thing you'll note though is that because it didn't have that third parameter, well, it's not really related to that. It actually just passed into the handler the event object, which is literally that word event again. That's how you reference it. Whereas in the DOM model, I can rename that parameter anything I want. So we had the equivalent of event.type for IE is what we saw with e.type. They don't call it target, or they didn't call it target. They called it a source element. They didn't have an equivalent for a current target. But you can prevent default with event.return value false, and then you can stop propagation with event.cancel pubble equals true. Every library that you use that has an event system handles this stuff for you. So it's the beauty of using a library. You don't have to think about things. So now this is where it all comes together, hopefully. Event delegation. This is my own definition. I was trying to think of how to define this, but using one event handler on an ancestor element to manage the interaction of descendant elements. So an example of where I've used this on the site is when we do, all right, hopefully okay, good. This is being recorded, so I won't talk about what happened. So we're searching for YouTube, right? When I click on this, this is going to show the YouTube video, and the things that I'm loading now don't exist on the page right now. I'm going and fetching them from the server, and no matter how many I do, I'm not attaching any new events, but when I click on this, this still works. So we have one event handler that's handling no matter how much stuff we shove into the container element. Since the container, since the current target of this can look in and see the target, we can actually hook up events for everything within it without adding extra event listeners. Because what happens in this circumstance, if I were to attach events to all of these links every time someone loads, and they load all of these, they click this 1,000 times, or with like people you may know, right? It's on a scroll event. So someone scrolls down, pretty soon they just keep looking, and you have hundreds of pages. Now, if you're going to attach events to every single thing within those cards, that would use up a lot of memory. So the idea is that you take advantage of the fact that all this stuff bubbles up to the surface, and then based on what the user clicked on by looking at the target, you can say, you know, we're gonna handle this event in some way. In this case, the way we did it, good, bad, or ugly, I don't know, it works, is we add an attribute on the element that's the content permalink. The other thing, by hijacking the link, which we do here, our URLs can sometimes be very ugly with go back and all this other stuff, and you know, they're not going directly to YouTube when you click on this link, right? So we store the original URL on an attribute in the link, and then when an event comes in at the top, we say, hey, does this link have a content permalink on it? What is it? Let's do a regex expression and see if this is a YouTube. If it is, and it has an ID, well, now we know how to handle this, right? So there's a little bit of overhead in the sense that you're listening to every click. When I click there and nothing happens, that same function is running, and it's testing to see what clicked on it, what's been clicked on. So there's a little bit of that, but really it's not that much. I mean, you could, I'm sure, have hundreds and hundreds of those, and it would be way better than having hundreds of event listeners listening. They're very simple checks. So it's a good way to program events, and it's a good way to basically say, here's a chunk of my page that has specific functionality. So I'm going to kind of figure out where's the right place to put that event listener, and then I'm just going to handle all of the events within this chunk and switch. Maybe have a click handler, maybe have a submit handler if you have a form in that section, things like that. And you can, or if you have multiple forms. Hopefully that makes sense. So here's some actual code so you can kind of see what that is like. Sure. It's right up here at the top. It's Pete Frueh / lowercase b 6, lowercase v as in Victor, lowercase h, uppercase s. So here we have a container. It has a list in it, and we have a number of different links. This is an example of event delegation. It's kind of a ridiculous example, as you'll see, but it'll show you how this works. So we're attaching, we get a reference to container. That's the one I say, hey, I'm going to handle every event within this section of the DOM. And within there, it basically looks at the target. So from the container, I'm looking down and saying, what did someone click on? If it has an attribute that, in this case, you know, data YouTube, I called it, right? If it has that, then that means it has, you know, this attribute. We want to do something different. So prevent default. So whatever you are going to do, I know you're going to navigate out since this is a link. Don't do that. And then run this function instead. And I'm going to do something. I'm going to take it over. So in this case, I click on it, and this function runs, and it just basically takes the data attribute, shoves it in the href, and then opens. If you click on it, attaches an event to that, so you can attach events on the fly. And when I click on it, it opens up in a new window. By the way, if any of these, you may have pop-up blockers going, so if this doesn't work, you probably have to shut those off. If they don't have that, then nothing happens, right? I'm just letting that event bubble through, and I'm not saying to don't go there explicitly. So this is how it works with event delegation. You can have all the different things. Some things you care about, whether they're clicked or not. Other things you don't care at all, and you just let them handle. And this is actually a really nice way when you think about things like accessibility. You know, all your links should go someplace legitimate, right? But if you do have JavaScript enabled, then you may want to give extra functionality and extra interaction and things like that. So the idea is that if you program for the case where it's just a flat document when you start and everything works, then you can add stuff on top of that. And that is actually it. We're a bit early. Questions? Anything related to events? So click is by far probably going to be the one you use the most. Submit, you have on mouse over, on mouse out. One thing I should mention here is that actually, the fact that we have libraries now, things like jQuery where they standardize the event object, there's certain events that don't bubble, like the browsers just were originally didn't have that. I think maybe submit does not bubble. jQuery makes everything behave the same way, for example. And in that case, you can actually, there's actually a lot of potential here with event delegation that we could improve our client-side structure, because you could actually just listen for events at the body of a page, or come up with some sort of way of managing events at the body level, and you'd never have to add another event on the page at all, if there was something complex enough that could handle all of those cases, right? So hopefully this gives you a little bit of food for thought of how we can handle all these things. Yep.
So being able to create any sort of arbitrary attribute on a node, is that always the case, or is that one of those things that like pre-IE9?
So as far as I can remember, you could also they used to be called custom attributes. The question was, have you also been able to create these kind of what in HTML5 are data attributes? And you could always say get attribute, and it would come back as that. So yeah, you definitely could, and it's actually there was a lot of I think tension about whether these are legit or not for a long time, and before HTML5 basically said, yeah, we're going to do it this way. And they're actually really useful. I used them a long time ago, and they're useful for things like, you imagine like a user ID, like in that example, right? You want to do stuff based on what was clicked, or you want to go fetch some new data, right? You want to get a hover card or something like that, for that specific person. You can just put the data on there, which is coming from the server. It has no impact on your document in a visual way, but it's associated with that link, which in this case would represent a person and a link to that person. So yeah, they've been around. You can reliably use them with anything that anyone's going to use. Yep.
Can you talk more about the inner HTML feature? Is it recommended to use it?
Yeah. So question was inner HTML. Yeah, use it. Definitely use it. Like I said, the importance of the DOM is that you're going to inevitably have to work with the DOM to reference those elements, but for getting things into the document very quickly, or changing it, it's basically an insertion, right? But but you can rewrite sections, and by just saying HTML. I don't know the specifics of it, but if you're going to change content, like anything is it's going to be less expensive than doing things with the DOM itself. So it's kind of a judgment call about which sections you want to need to be reloaded or need to be re-rendered, right? So I don't know if that answers it.
So there was a DOM load event. Are there other interesting events in that sort of vein?
The DOM load. Yeah, I mean, that's the primary one that from the browser side you'll probably use. I don't know if anyone else thinking. So you're thinking like more like kind of bomb-related events. So
you said DOM load, and there was a page load event.
Right.
What else happens in between? Is there something interesting?
I don't know what happens in between. Those are the two primary ones for loading that you'll have to be concerned with. And again, it's just the difference between when the browser, knows about the full, it's converted all of that into a DOM object versus everything has, for this associated object has been loaded. Anything else? Yeah, so that's actually just part of the browser. The reason they did that, so the question was, like you sometimes get this where I'm using alerts, so I'm alerting multiple times, and it comes up with this message now in recent versions of browsers that says, do you want to prevent this page from showing any more alerts? And you can say yes or no. I don't know, like I can think of one circumstance where that would be horrendous is if you pointed someone to a page and you just start looping stuff through and crash their browser, right? By just saying alert, 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 alert. They can never click fast enough to get out of that page, right? So you can essentially freeze people out. I think that's where that comes from, is basically a way to give the user control over someone who's doing something stupid or malicious. So yeah, it's more that than it is actually anything related to the bubbling.
Is that a global setting, or will it only be applicable to that particular site? For example, my web page needs some kind of color change to work. Maybe
Yeah.
disables it, then the app will not work.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, people don't typically use alerts anymore at all because of that. It's something built into the browser, and it's kind of even with like confirmation dialogues, right? Most of those are just custom things now. They don't use the browser's native confirm function on the window. So, Jim.
What's a custom event?
Custom event. So that's another talk.
In your experience, what's like the best language or extension or plugin or library or API for manipulating the DOM?
I haven't really used it much outside of JavaScript. I played with it with Java years ago. There are some differences in how those languages implement the interface. In other words, you don't get a direct one-to-one, like here's my object, and this is always a property. It might be like a getter setter or something like that, versus JavaScript. Sometimes you can directly assign things. But I haven't really looked enough at different implementations. I think it's just a way of managing documents no matter what your favorite language is. I don't know how widely it's used outside of JavaScript, but it's basically, like JavaScript itself. I mean, you're kind of, you're constrained, you're forced to do it one way, right? Which is why, it's surprising that JavaScript is still around, given that most people, including myself when I first learned it, dislike it. And, but that's the language of the browser, so that's what we got. Anyone? All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. And next week is DOM scripting, and I'm not sure what else. Next Tuesday, Wednesday. Debugging. Awesome. Thanks, guys.